George Zimmerman's defense still hasn't used George Zimmerman as a witness. They have the only witness who knows exactly what happened that night, and they haven't used him yet. But today, they tried to use Trayvon Martin's father.
We begin in the courtroom on day 10 of testimony.
New developments at the trial of George Zimmerman, now in its third week.
Any moment now, George Zimmerman's lawyers will start calling witnesses.
The defense is presenting its case.
The defense calls friends of George Zimmerman to testify.
State your name, please.
Sandra Osterman.
Mark Osterman. John Donnelly.
Jerry Russo.
Whose voice is crying for help?
Questions about who was screaming for help.
Whose voice it was on the 911 call.
The 911 recording from the night Trayvon Martin died.
Have you ever had an opportunity to listen to that phone call?
Do you hear yells for help?
Do you have an opinion as to whose voice that is?
Are they continuous yells for help?
Were you able to identify Mr. Zimmerman's voice?
When's the first time you heard that tape? You listened to it on the radio? Or?
Defense attorney Mark O'Mara says among the witnesses he plans to call to the stand.
Could the defense also call Martin's father to the stand?
Trayvon Martin's father.
Does anyone have a better argument than the other?
Only two people really know what happened on that evening.
About whether it was George Zimmerman or Trayvon Martin.
This is day 20 of this trial, day 10 of testimony.
The defense team says they plan to wrap up their presentation to the jury by mid to late week.
Court is in recess until 8:30 in the morning.
The shocker in the George Zimmerman trial today was that George Zimmerman's defense called Trayvon Martin's father as a witness. It was a very risky tactic for the defense, which they apparently thought was worth it after the testimony of Chris Serino today, the lead investigator of the Zimmerman case, who was the very first person to play the audio tape of a 911 call where someone can be heard screaming before George Zimmerman shot and killed Trayvon Martin. He played that for Trayvon Martin's father.
I believe my words were, is that your son's voice in the background? Or something. I think I said a little differently than that, but I inquired as if that was, in fact, his son yelling for help.
And what was his response?
It was more of a verbal and nonverbal. He looked away and under his breath, as I interpreted, said no.
The defense used another police officer to set up the testimony from Trayvon Martin's father.
Do you recall what it was that you heard Officer Serino ask Mr. Martin after playing the loud 911 call?
If you recognize the voice.
Okay. Again, do you have the exact words, or you remember?
I don't know if those were exact words, but that was the question, if he had recognized the voice.
Okay, and Mr. Martin's response?
That it was not his son.
Then came the defense's dramatic tactic, calling Tracy Martin to the stand.
As best as I recall, after he played the tape, he basically just said, "Do you recognize the voice?"
And what was your response?
My response was just simply, I didn't tell him that I didn't know. I didn't tell him, no, that wasn't Trayvon. I think the chairs had wheels on them, and I kind of pushed away from the table and just kind of shook my head and said, I can't tell.
So your words were, I can't tell.
Something to that effect, but I never said, no, that wasn't my son's voice.
The next time Tracy Martin says he heard the 911 tape was at the mayor's office in March of 2012.
What did you say about the tape when you listened to it that time in the mayor's office?
What do you mean, what did I say? Did
you acknowledge anything about the tape to anybody?
After listening to the tape for maybe 20 times, I said I knew that it was Trayvon's voice.
Joining me now, MSNBC legal analyst Lisa Bloom and Faith Jenkins, a former criminal prosecutor. Lisa, I can't remember seeing a move like this. This was so risky for the defense to be calling Trayvon Martin's father. How do you think it worked in the courtroom?
I'm sorry, was Tracy Martin on trial today? Right? Because if he was guilty. He was guilty of being grief-stricken and upset and putting his head down when he heard the recording of his son's final moments before the bullet shot rang out that killed his son. I mean, what a ridiculous distraction for the defense. This, to me, is one of the biggest blunders they've made, right up there with putting George Zimmerman on Hannity to say that killing Trayvon Martin was God's plan. I mean, this was a disaster for them.
Faith, it was shocking to me to see them, because it is so risky, and the one thing you lawyers don't like to do is take risks in a courtroom where you don't know how it's going to work. And his testimony, I think it made perfect sense to me that he would have the reaction he did, basically being asked, you know, do you recognize that sound? And he's never heard that sound.
Right. The substance of his testimony was very compelling and very believable to these jurors, and I think to people watching today too. But look at how the defense tried to set it up. They put these police officers up first who didn't equivocate about what he said in terms of him saying, no, it wasn't my son's voice. But I think the prosecutor did such an effective job of bringing out from Mr. Martin what an emotional moment this was for him. He just heard his son being shot and killed in that moment on that tape. And so his testimony, the substance of his testimony, I think was really compelling today.
Lisa, the point Faith makes, the defense called back Chris Serino, called back these two police officers. They gave this testimony that basically said, when we played the tape for him, he said, the way they put it is, he said it wasn't his son's voice. Why wouldn't the defense lawyers have left it at that? When you bring in Tracy Martin, it actually made much more sense the way he responded.
That would have been enough. There may have been a discussion at sidebar. We don't know this, but my hunch as a trial lawyer is that those two got to testify about what would be hearsay, what Tracy Martin said, subject to tying it all up with Tracy Martin himself testifying.
So do you think both sides knew that this was going to be the sequence today?
Yes, I do. Again, that's my educated guess as a trial lawyer.
So, Faith, that would suggest that Tracy Martin would have been given a heads up that you're going to be called today.
I think he expected to be called today. After I saw the cross-examination of Sabrina Fulton by Mark O'Mara, I expected them to call Tracy as a witness today after the state didn't, because they are being now very aggressive. You usually don't see an attorney cross-examining a grieving mother in the way Sabrina was cross-examined. So I knew after I saw that cross-examination, I'm sure they prepared him, you could be called as a defense witness.
But there's a disadvantage. I mean, lawyers normally consider it a disadvantage to have Tracy Martin on the stand as the defense's own witness, because they can't really they can't use the same techniques of cross-examination when you call them as a witness.
Right. And think about what Mark O'Mara said on cross-examination of Trayvon's mother. You hope that's your son, don't you? Because the alternative is too painful. Well, isn't that equally true for all of his 7 witnesses who said that's George Zimmerman's voice on the 911 call? They were all family and friends of George Zimmerman.
I want to play a sample of the witnesses that preceded all of this who were saying, I know George Zimmerman and that's his voice on the 911. Let's listen to this.
Do you know whose voice that is in the background screaming?
Yes, definitely. It's Georgie.
The screaming or the noise in the background. Do you have an opinion whose voice that is?
I thought it was George.
Can you identify whose voice that was yelling in the background?
George's.
Do you have an opinion as to whose voice that is in the background?
Yes, I do.
And whose voice is it?
George Zimmerman's voice.
Whose voice do you believe that to be screaming for help?
There's absolutely no doubt in my mind that is George Zimmerman. And I wish to God I did not have that ability to understand that.
Lisa Bloom, I got to say, I don't know how a jury can accept that there's absolutely no doubt in your mind. We've all listened to that tape. None of us can sit here and say, oh, that's, George, or that's Trayvon. You can't do it. You can make your best approximation, and that's why it seemed to me that the kind of humility in Trayvon's brother, for example, in the way he talked about what he thinks he heard, sounds more real to me than there's no doubt in my mind.
Or Tracy Martin, who says initially he just hung his head down, kind of an oh my God reaction, then he had to hear it a few more times. How can you be certain? None of the 10 witnesses who have said for sure it's either Trayvon Martin or George Zimmerman said they heard either of them screaming hysterically in any kind of similar circumstances, which is obviously very different than normal conversation. And of course, none of them knew both men's voices so that they could compare. Frankly, if I were on the jury, I don't don't think any of this testimony would be all that significant to me.
And remember, George Zimmerman said when he first listened to this call, that doesn't even sound like me. He said that about hearing his own voice. So how can these witnesses then come in and say, oh yes, I recognize his voice, that sounds just like him, when the person who's screaming said that didn't even sound like him.
And even if that is George Zimmerman's voice, his reaction, that doesn't sound like me, is a perfectly understandable reaction under these circumstances. Lisa, you've been making the point that I think has been present throughout the trial, but has not yet been really isolated in the testimony, that George Zimmerman says the gun was here, was right on the hip, kind of in the back on the right. He also says, I'm down on the ground, he's got me pinned down. You're asking the question, how does that gun ever get out of that spot?
Right, it's time to start putting all of this evidence together, right? So we know that, first of all, the holster is an inside the waistband holster, which means it's almost completely covered by the pants. Add to that, George Zimmerman is wearing a shirt that goes out over the gun and a jacket that was open. It was very dark, it was raining. And when I looked at his reenactment video, which has been admitted into evidence, he demonstrates by touching his hand to the back of his right side, although he moves his arms around a lot, that's where he says the gun was holstered, all right? So when you put, as you say, Trayvon Martin on top of him, as he says, knees to armpits, he's really pinned. It's very hard to understand how Trayvon Martin would have seen the gun. And of course, that's the essence of his self-defense story. Trayvon Martin saw the gun, he reached for the gun. If the jury doesn't believe that, he's got a real trouble with the
Faith, and this goes to something that was testified to today. They actually brought on his trainer in what I thought was one of the more irrelevant moments. But what they were bringing out was George was a really terrible fighter. It was this guy's job to train him as a fighter, and he kept saying how bad a student George was, which is to say how bad a fighter he was, which is to say he's the guy who absolutely can't pull off this move of getting the gun out of there. He's the guy who will never pull off that move.
Right, and in addition to that, it's this testimony really, what you're talking about goes to George Zimmerman's knowledge of self-defense and stand your ground, because when you think about shooting someone in a justifiable homicide, one of the best defenses you can possibly put on is that person went for my gun and then told me you're going to die tonight. So there's no question, if someone tells me that in my mind, that they are going to kill me. It's almost too perfect. And so having that combination there, I think the prosecutor is going to tie that into the fact he has all of this knowledge about self-defense law and how to come up with a good defense. And this scenario, which is improbable, is just too perfect.
Lisa Bloom and Faith Jenkins, thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thank you.
Coming up, we have breaking news in Wisconsin, where a federal judge has stopped the implementation of a new anti-abortion law signed by Governor Scott Walker this weekend. And we have new video of Edward Snowden tonight talking about how he turned against his employer. And in the rewrite tonight, the Washington media criticizes